10x your service design offering with Smaply. Take 20% off any order with This Is HCD 20 off. Let's superpower you and your design team's potential. Sign up at smaply.app. Enjoy the episode from your friends at Smaply, helping support This Is HCD podcast.
Andy Farnell is a British computer scientist and author who is a pioneer in sound design. Reading his latest book, Digital Vegan, gave me profound insights into the challenges we face in relation to creating truly sustainable and equitable technology. It has clear paths forward, which involve a greater belief in humanity and that we can do so much more with so much less. I started our chat by asking Andy to explain a bit the process of what happens to a digital product after it becomes waste.
You can take apart many electronic devices and you find that they're made of components. And these, components historically is how electronics has always been made. We've had like radio valves and transistors and then integrated circuits. And generally they're soldered together using a molten sort of lead or tin these days on the board. And what would happen in the old days is you would strip down electronics to reuse the components. So we would take off integrated circuits. And to the extent that electronics is modular, and so many pieces of modern electronics are modular, we could take out, say, a camera element which has got an SPI or an I2C bus, standard kind of connector, and put that aside for use in another constructing something else. So electronics hobbyists and electronics repair people, to the extent they still exist, have always had this relationship with electronics, is that you can take it apart and you can reuse the sub-assemblies and so on. Now, when we come to recycling modern goods, rather little of that happens. And if it does happen, it happens very early in the chain after the goods have kind of been received by like a warehouse. They're going to then say, okay, we can take that display off, we can take those loudspeakers off, we can sell them somewhere else, we can put them back into the market or reuse them. So there is a kind of market in that, but it's diminishing, and I think probably heading towards non-existence now. Most of the smaller goods, let's distinguish them from white goods to begin with, because that's a different matter. Those things like washing machines and tumble dryers, and it's made of steel. It can be taken apart manually. It can be sort of, the bolts can be unscrewed and things in seconds with kind of the right machine tools. And so that has a much better recycling prospect. Things from the magnets, neodymium, cobalt, things that are in the larger assemblies of white goods can be stripped down and have a much better recycling prospect. But then all of the other stuff, the digital cameras, phones, tablets, laptops and whatever, this is a different kind of e-waste. Nobody is going to bother to try to reclaim that at the component level. So what happens to it? Well, most of it right now, almost all of it is getting shipped abroad. So it comes over on container ships as goods for us to use as new. It has a sort of average lifespan of about 18 months, which is shockingly low. And then those phones and tablets go back into containers and they're taken to where the labour cost and the environmental regulations are low enough for them to be processed in an economically viable way, as they would say. So first kind of step that's going to happen there is a lot of it is just shredded. It's smashed to pieces. And so that process is sometimes, it's machine, like you use things basically like giant wood shredders, it unleashes an enormous amount of particulate matter, microplastics just spewing out of that, heavy metals, anything that those goods are made of, including the forever chemicals, the phenol, multi-polyfluorinated hydrocarbons, things like that. It was going to make a miasma of dust. But worse is when it's not done by machines, because who's going to do it? It's usually young kids, employ 14, 15, 16-year-old kids, literally with sledgehammers, smashing this stuff up. You've got cathode ray screens being broken, and the dust comes out of that. So we've got this pulverized mess. And what we're going to do with it now is to extract the metals from it, which means washing it with acid, like aqua regia type nitric acid, sulfuric acid, and also things like sodium cyanide, compounds which will pull out these metals, into a slurry, and then the very difficult task is to separate the valuable metals from it. So there's several techniques. There's kind of staged precipitation where you can use different compounds which will cause, say, the gold to precipitate out, or the silver, the copper, or whatever. Or you can use these resin columns, which are like big chromatography columns, which will attach. They'll attach the salts to the right part, and then you can wash that off and reuse them. And then there's this new technology which is kind of been, it's old, but it's kind of been made real in Canada, which is electrostatic precipitation. And so we have in the West much better ways of doing this, which child labour is doing on the shores, using literally burning stuff in a bonfire. And pouring drums of acid onto it, and it's leaching into the sea and stuff like that, and it's all ending up in the lungs of those children who really have a very poor prognosis, I would say.
I was just thinking of there, as you were saying, which was a worse profession, the chimney sweep or the e-waste recycler. Probably the chimney sweep was a safer profession than the child, breathing in this really dangerous toxic dust.
Yeah, it's such a mixture of different forms of toxicity. There's a bioaccumulative toxicity of things that are going to get into the fatty tissues, going to stay in the bloodstream for decades. And those kinds of things have, genetic mutagenic effects. And they're often, if the children survive into adulthood, then they're going to have children with problems. And, that's a kind of an issue on the radar, is around these recycling plants. And this whole industry is an enormous number of sort of birth defects and low IQ kind of outcomes for children. So that's not good. But then there's the immediate toxicity effects that metal fume fever, any kind of things like lead and so on, mercury will cause immediate cognitive kind of impact. So these kids have got no real future educationally if they manage to get out of that kind of backbreaking and toxic sort of industry. And then there was the sort of non-human aspects of again, things that are getting into the water table, which we'll talk about, I guess, soon as well. It gets into the water table, it gets into fish, and then it's recycled back biologically into human food chain. So people who are not in the immediate vicinity of the recycling plant are then having to eat poisoned produce.
Somebody was writing a report that some of it is coming back to the places that send it, in a certain type of karma that fish being caught and eaten at European tables were showing trace elements of, particularly the fish that had started or spawned in the seas off North Africa, so there's it never goes away. This stuff, a lot of it, as you mentioned there, the forever chemicals, a lot of this stuff never goes away. or stays for a long time. Any senses of that, the length that some of this stuff is likely to stay. Well, I suppose if it goes into the air, it'll probably end up, ultimately moving to the land or the water. But when it gets into the soil or water, it doesn't just dissolve, does it? A lot of these materials are forever materials in the soil, or will they degrade over time? Most of them.
Well, elemental materials will not. They will stay forever because that's the nature of matter. It's not destroyed. So if we take, say, a cadmium salt or something, a heavy metal salt, that's going to stick around forever. But it's not necessarily going to be hazardous in that form. So it may form a stable and a salt that's not going to circulate too much. It'll kind of become bound or attached to something. On the other hand, there were the many organic chemicals that we've mentioned, these bromofluoro things that are used in fire retardants and things like that. They've got a kind of half-life of hundreds of years, and they're very volatile. So they'll keep being kind of, if you like, raised from the ground. They can seep and leach and get into water and circulate around the oceans. And then there are things that are simply very durable. I mean, plastics. And then the problem with microplastics is that the more that you leave them, the more that they abrade and break down into smaller and smaller and smaller chains, until they're just even single little polymer chains. And it's turning out that they are super efficient at getting around, and there's almost nowhere left on Earth that there isn't microplastic pollution. It's in lots of animal life. It's in the Arctic and Antarctic ice sheets. It's on the top of mountains. It's at the bottom of the ocean in the Mariana Trench. This stuff it's everywhere. But the potential toxic effects of that are unknown at the moment. So that's kind of a little bit scary because there's an unknown there. But then it might not be so bad. These things that didn't necessarily exist before do exist. Now, going back to the old George Carlin sketch, and he says, hey, maybe the planet, that's the only reason the planet needed us, was to make plastic. And now it's the Earth plus plastic. So it's not like it's a completely unnatural thing. I mean, in a sense, nothing is unnatural, right? Because it's a byproduct of sentient humanoid life is that we make plastic. Who knows what that portends in the future, whether it bodes ill for us in terms of health, or whether it causes some other event, like a new form of bacterium or something that finds that it can live in these small polymer chains or something like that. There's a big unknown surrounding microplastics, really.
Yeah, and I suppose the thing is we don't know, so it's like we're gambling with the future of life, hoping that it'll be relatively benign, but if it behaves in the same way as the macroplastics behave, it's not going to be good, or it's unlikely that it's going to help life flourish, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think there's going to be good. It's just how bad is it going to be? Yeah.
We were talking about the children earlier, and these are children in Pakistan or children in Ghana. And there was a UN report, I think, last year that estimated about 18 million children, or either 13 million children and 18 million women, or the other way around. But it's a substantial number of people who are the informal recyclers, so to speak. And this is, obviously the technology industry is very aware of this, and the governments are very aware of this. We just don't care. That's another burden that the global south needs to bear for the lifestyle of the global north? Is that's in essence, is it, because there's lots of evidence that this is constantly happening, and there's half attempts to address it, but there's no real serious attempts to address it, or do you, or what you're talking, is it, basically we dump our waste, this toxic waste, on poor people? Is that the basic strategy?
Interesting things are happening. I mean, the fact that we're having this conversation is very important. There are changes afoot in lots of parts of the regulatory frameworks around the industries. The most exciting thing that I've seen this week was the Royal Mint in Britain talking about a massive recycling scheme using a new technique, an electrostatic separation technique, to remove gold from e-waste. Now, I've kind of always said that if you were a really smart person who wanted to make an investment for well outside the scope of your own lifetime, for your great-grandchildren, is to buy landfills, because that's the prime mining ground for the future, at least the early ones into which lots of electronic waste went before it was illegal to dump it there. The Royal Mint have kind of realised that the economics of the gold that can be recovered, gold and platinum, in fact, that can be recovered from e-waste it's worth it. It's worth keeping it here and not shipping it back and processing it here in the West to recover those rare metals. So it's not like this isn't on anyone's radar. I think we're raising awareness of it in what we're talking about today, and hopefully it's going. There's going to be more changes afoot.
You made a really interesting point in the intro. This is multiple really interesting points, but one of them about the historical repairer or disassembler of technology, that you could pull components out. And is there any way that we can either legislate or so that we return to designs that are much easier to disassemble, that are much more environmentally take apartable, or is this an inevitable part of modern products because of their smaller size? Is this just modern technology is designed to be earth destructive, or older technology was much more genuinely circular economy about, whereas what we're dealing with in an iPhone or a Lenovo laptop or whatever is things that are among the least have among the least capacities to be part of a circular economy. And if is there any way we can get back to a genuine circular economy for electronics, or are we trapped in this toxic waste cauldron for modern electronics?
And there's so many points to distill out of that. So let's just think about what this electronic stuff is, and it's nothing but cleverly organized sand. The miracle of the semiconductor industry is that it's made from silicon, fundamentally the most abundant element on the planet after oxygen, I think. So, most of the planet's got made of sand in one form or another, flint, whatever. So this incredibly super abundant element means that in the limit, the cost of technology tends to zero. Which is staggering. We've been coming to terms with that for the past 50 years at least. things just not only get smaller and smaller and smaller, but really, if you look at the economics of the scale of semiconductor production, they get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So there is this, incentive to just, it's a solution looking for a problem. It's an industry that's overproducing, and so we're just putting electronics into things. We're looking for places to put it. It's a push market, right? It's not demand driven. The other thing is that it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So in the limit, it kind of has zero cost and it disappears entirely from view. The pieces of electronic equipment 50 years ago were pieces of furniture. There were items and objects within your household that you could see. Modern electronics kind of does this vanishing act. So you need to bear in mind those two factors in terms of what that means for recyclability. If something goes to zero cost, then there's no margin, there's no point left in recycling it. You may as well treat it as that the sink is the environment. It just needs to be washed away when I'm done with it. In terms of size, as things get smaller and smaller, they're now well beyond. I mean, I used to fix electronic equipment. Now, 10 years ago, when I was working with the smallest surface mount devices, I needed a bench microscope just to be able to see what I'm doing. Now, you need a kind of times 100 bench microscope because, and if you sneeze, you literally blow away £1,000 worth of components. So it's beyond the capabilities of the human physicality, our fingers, our eyes, and so on, to deal with lots of this electronics. If it's going to be disassembled, if it's going to be recycled, it needs robotics, it needs machines and production lines to do that. So what's the answer? Well, the answer is a cultural change, that we change towards modularity, in that these things are designed right from the outset to sort of plug together very much like little Lego bricks. And there are many initiatives, many engineering projects that have been going for a long time and are ramping up now to change the way that the electronics industry operates, to change the way that assembly is done, to change the way that components are combined together. So there's a big incentive to do sort of just-in-time or last-step configuration. People used to build their own PCs, right? To build a computer by getting a power supply and a motherboard and a thing. Well, now that PC is kind of the size of a matchbox or a sort of packet of cigarettes, and the bits inside it are just sort of size of small Lego bricks. But you can physically still just put them together. Now, what that means, say, for things like phone assemblies, is that they can be repurposed, they can be disassembled and reconfigured by the end user or by kind of workshops in the economy of the countries that they end up in. So it's a very different way of designing that needs to be done, and that will only work if it's based on a culture of valuing the components and their functions. So valuing memory chips, valuing a radio transmitter chip, and so on, as something of value in itself, which and that won't happen unless you have widespread interoperability legislation. So there's this very difficult thing to sort of put together, where you need to get the culture change, and you need to get the legislative change, and you need to get the engineering change, all happening at the same time, to push us into this different system of manufacture and reuse.
You said there as well about cost. The cost is going to zero, but maybe that's because of the cost model rather than the actual cost. Like, we know the cost to those 30 million poor people. We know the cost to the water system. We know the cost to Chilean farmers, in the uplands where the lithium mining is occurring, or in the western lowlands, to the western lowland gorillas where coltan is mined, or to the Taiwanese farmers who don't have enough water because the water's going to the chip, plant. So there's lots of costs. We just don't measure them. And I think maybe we need a different sort of cost model that actually looks at the total cost of this, not simply the cost to, just manufacturing, that for Intel or otherwise. Maybe our costing models are all wrong.
I think they always have been. That these grotesque externalities have always been part of industry. I mean, since the Industrial Revolution, we're much more aware of them now. And yeah, how do we bring those in, which will provide further incentives to reusing components? And the standardization and the interoperability stuff is so important for other reasons, right? It's liberating. It breaks down monopolies. It provides opportunity for innovation and for new companies to spring up using reconfigurations and reuses of old technology. It's so enabling for the economy in other ways as well. So it's something we really want to move towards. Yeah.
Do you think young people are actually aware of these issues in the extent that they need to be? And also, a point that you made in your excellent book, about the need to remove technology from schools, which seems like a heretical thing for a technologist like yourself to be proposing, but that what we need is maybe less technology in schools and more education with our young people about the entire awareness of living and the impacts, or maybe you'd like to say something about those topics.
Well, this is a huge cultural subject. It's no longer about e-waste. E-waste is a symptom of a culture, a society, a way of doing industry that we live in, which we know is not sustainable, which we know has profound mental, psychological, educational effects on us. The depression, the teen suicides, the sort of anomie and alienation, that's all come from what ostensibly is a wonderful thing. This is brilliant technology that's supposed to bring us all together and revolutionize the world and so on. And that's not what's happened. I can look back in my life at 50 years and remember the optimism of being a kid growing up playing with electronics in the 70s and 80s, and then seeing now that those tools, the enabling tools, have been turned around to become tools of control, monitoring, very dystopian kind of cybernetic governance model. Even the father of cybernetics himself, Norman Weiner, said, he was really against it. He kind of likened it to eugenics. Said that this is a dark path if you start to apply this socially. So there's that side to it in which young people are utterly lost in their relationship to technology. It's not something that they feel that serves them. It's something that they feel they are already enslaved to from very early age. The kind of behavioural paradigms that they see. The addiction that their parents will be on the phone almost constantly from the moment that they're born. They have to compete with the phone for attachment needs, and so there's this this big picture, if you like, sociological or psychological relationship between young people and technology now that you have to take into mind before you can even start to think about these questions. There's a total absence, as far as I can see, of teaching about technology. And my tagline is that we should teach our children about technology and not allow them to be taught by technology. Because what's happening is that technology is replacing the teachers, of course, because it's it's efficient, and they can use lower skilled people and just give the kids a tablet and some Microsoft software or something, and and they're they're brand loyal for life, right? They're drawn in, but also you can mine them for data, psychometric data, which is part of the surveillance capitalism and the whole kind of cybernetic machinery. So there's not much that's a positive relationship there between young people and technology at the moment. And I think before we can move forward with these environmental questions, because we're going to depend on them on their behaviour in the future, we need to win back hearts and minds that way. We need to, for the children, for the kids, to take back tech. They need to feel ownership and stewardship and sort of some control in their relationship to technology. And at the moment, it's going completely the opposite way. Technology is becoming something further and further from their sphere of influence.
I think maybe connected with that, we need them to kind of take back their environment to some extent, in the sense of, a lot of people, when I talk to them about, my book Worldwide Waste, or, digital and stuff like that, they literally do think it's all in the cloud. Like that there's this disassociation or increasing disassociation and separation. You don't see, the impact of what you do, or, you don't see yourself walking in the sand. You don't see your footprints. You're disassociated, and there's no sense of the material or either the technology or that you're a kind of an actor within your environment, impacting that environment. So you'll see at demonstrations for, which is good for the environment and young people, but them taking tons and tons of photos and uploading to the cloud and latest devices, and they're pro the environment, but they don't in any way think that this device they have in their hand, or all those tens of thousands of photos that is being taken, has any impact.
I absolutely agree with this. It's this sense of disassociation, on many levels, the psychological process of dissociation, which is not being present. It is that's an aspect of the use of technology. But then the physical technology itself, the lack of association of what you do with anything material, it's utterly abstracted and like, as you say, kind of when there was a study done, and several hundred children were asked to draw pictures of the internet, and they kind of drew clouds and sort of like a map in the sky, and there's Google land, and there's eBay land, and there's Netflix land, and it's the idea of a physical computer. If you'd gone back sort of 30 years and asked children to draw, they would have drawn physical computers, whereas the modern kids had drawn these iconic versions. They draw a little bird for Twitter, and they draw the icons, a save button, a picture of a sort of a save icon, a floppy disk icon, to indicate the idea that there's a place somewhere in the abstract void that you could write data to, and I think that theme maybe meshes with one of the ones I bring up in Digital Vegan about the meat industry. When I grew up in a little cottage farm where we, I've at least had to round up the chickens knowing their fate. I wasn't, didn't have to actually kill them myself, but we had a connection with our food at the very least. In the kind of 70s and 80s, there was, a self-sufficiency fad, and people, I think we probably grew about like half of our own produce and sort of shared it with other people in the village. Well, now everything is behind a curtain. It's sort of Tesco's or Sainsbury's or whatever, and you've no idea where food comes from or how it grows. So that's happened with technology, the same thing, and whether or not that connection can be re-established, and what that would mean or how, I don't know, but it's definitely missing now.
Yeah, and maybe that moving on to what we can do about this, and there's two things. There's a fascinating thing you talk about in your book about intelligence amplification, IA, as opposed to AI, and it reminded me of something that I've been working on myself. Is not as fully realized as a theory, but it's a kind of like, if it had a tagline, it would be burn your own energy. That we, this feeling or this sense that we are increasingly, replacing things that we could physically do and would be good for us, healthy and all sorts of things, mentally. Like, if I don't send too many letters, physical letters anymore, but if I have to send a letter, I can never remember how much the postage was. So, I'm always, going to Google, but I could remember it if I really made the effort, so instead of using my memory, or instead of, getting up and going out and doing something, and that there's so many things that we could do physically that are good for us and good for the planet, good for health, good for social interaction, but we're getting the technology to do it out of convenience, because Amazon or whatever in the process. And I think it feels to me that there's a link, that idea of burn your own energy, rather than, the energy of a device or a machine in the process. There's a kind of a connection with this concept you have, or intelligence amplification, as opposed to artificial intelligence. Maybe tell us a little bit about, from the point of view of, this seems like a path forward where none of us are saying, let's get rid of technology. That's not the debate remotely. But, this seems like a potential path forward. Just give us a bit of insight on it.
There's a nice quote by the artist and writer Max Frisch. It says that technology is a way for humans to not experience the world. It's a way. It's the distancing effect, the action at a distance, the diffusion of responsibility, the lots of the things that go along with technology put the world that they move us from out of the physical realm, from the material realm, into the kind of world of pure thought, and from the sort of Enlightenment trajectory, that is kind of more noble. It's the noble thing is to be pure thought. It's more godlike. There's a quasi religion around technology. You have to accept that. It's there from Nietzsche's writing, and interesting what comes from the German school, even Heidegger, and people like that who you can't even speak of these days, but they got it. They said, wow, there is this and in Silicon Valley there's the sort of cosmist thing still going on, where they just want to upload themselves into the cloud and become sort of non-embodied beings, immortal and omnipotent and so on. That there is this definite quasi-religious angle to technological trajectories, and what that's doing, is taking people into a realm in which they are foregoing, they are abdicating responsibility for things. I think that convenience is a really dirty word. It's an insidious word because it's used so easily, kind of slipped into a conversation. Oh, well, that's convenient, isn't it? And it kind of stops examination. It's who would not want convenience? Well, too much convenience is going to kill you. Atrophy your muscles, atrophy your mind, strip you of all agency, self-determination. It's like any drug, that it's seductive, it pulls you in, and eventually that it's an original deadly sin, isn't it? Sloth, I guess, is the one. It's sloth, or that tendency, what the Greeks would call towards thanatos, towards death and forgetfulness, is a seductive side of technology that will do everything for you because it reduces you back to an infantile state of dependency. So how do you fight that? Well, you have to integrate technology in a kind of, as Aristotle and Heidegger and people like that had seen, is it becomes an extension of the mind body. So the technology is it's not a substitute for yourself or an alternative for the self, but it's an extension of the self, and that is intelligence amplification. And it goes back to the old idea. There's these two fundamentally conflicting models of technology. One is IA, which is that technology is a tool. It extends your mind body. It allows you to amplify thought and action and empowers you. Whereas the modern the trajectory that we're heading down with technology right now is more towards AI, which is cybernetic governance, which is unthinking use of technology. There's literally books on user interface design called "Don't Make Me Think," in which your relationship with technology is, don't worry, it's going to do everything for you. So you can just regress and kind of lay back and into the land of milk and honey. And don't worry, the technology's got your back. Well, that's the path to nihilistic non-existence. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say there as well. That don't make me think, because that's it's also a book in user experience, which for years I thought was, the amazing, result. The ultimate result of a good designer, would be, making the process so that you're renewing your car tax or whatever in a way that's so simple you don't have to think about it. The steps are really well designed, and most people who would have been involved in that would not have thought of themselves as dystopian designers.
No, not at all. It's Krug, isn't it? Krug. I think. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to rag on him. He's that there is wisdom in that, right? There is, if you reduce the scope of what you're thinking about to slick interaction, then that's how. Don't Make Me Think. That's what a great title, and what a great way to do it. But what is the thing that you're not thinking about? Here's the question. What is it that you wish to push from your mind? And you mentioned, say, you like doing your tax. Well, you'd like a very low friction, slick way to do your tax. Let's take it to the limit. Why are you even doing your tax in the first place? If it's something for which you want to abrogate all responsibility and knowledge and oversight, why doesn't the government just do it for you, right? Or somebody else, or some machinery? And so the question becomes, well, what is it that you wish to actively engage in life? What do you wish to have control over, and why? Because what we're actually creating with a lot of technology is just what David Graeber calls this bullshit economies. It's a make work economy in which we write software to solve problems that don't exist, so that people have kind of got something to do. And so often, as a sort of legacy of a job that existed before, and it's now mutated into the digital domain, and it carries on as a sort of zombie job where somebody's got to do that. And you have a suite of software and things that do that, but nobody really cares. They just want to. What they'd really like is a little pecking bird that Homer Simpson has in the episode where he has to run the nuclear power plant from home. Do you remember that? This is just like, stupid bird, it's pecking away at the Y key. That's really what we're constructing with lots of technology. We might as well replace ourselves with small shells, with small scripts, with AI and things. That is a very dangerous path to go down if all you're thinking about is how do I shrug agency and responsibility through technology. You're left with nothing of your own life or society.
Yeah. Now, I don't know if it's an exact example of intelligence amplification or human amplification, but it's something that I've been reading a lot about over the last couple of years, bicycles. And, how that a bicycle, if you go 10 kilometers on a bicycle versus walking 10 kilometers, there's actually less CO2 emitted cycling because of the energy of walking. So somebody did all these calculations that a bicycle was an amazing device in that it was not just neutral, but almost positive from, a waste or energy consumption. But connected with that, I'm seeing a lot about the cargo bikes now, the bikes that have battery. Of course, the battery on a cargo bike is 100 of the battery that's required from an electric vehicle, or certainly a vastly less. And there was a study recently which said that people who had bought cargo bikes were traveling or cycling more than twice as much. So they were actually physically cycling more, but they were using the battery to go up hills, and so that the technology had worked in a way, so the bicycle being an amazing technology, but actually adding a battery to the bicycle was another amazing development, because it got us fitter. We did more shopping. That there are ways of bringing technology into our lives, which is good for the planet, is good for ourselves. It keeps us fit, keeps us thinking. Might that be an example of, or
Absolutely. I mean, what you're saying is just an eminently sound philosophy. It's a wisdom. The bicycle is already an optimal machine. And then you're adding another optimal technology on top of that. These are very small, relatively small capacity but efficient batteries and good modern motors. To augment that. And what you end up with, if you sort of to draw a landscape of the possibilities of technology, is a local maxima. It's a place where, all of the things conspire to produce a technology that's just good all round. It's like you say, it's making you fit, it's getting you outside, it's a recyclable technology, it's super efficient, and we can have this. We can absolutely have this in computing, right? But I think that the reasons why we don't have it is it's not explained simply by the fact that we haven't found it or some sort of suboptimal search. There are forces that have been conspiring for a long time and still are to give us suboptimal technologies, because that is very profitable for some people. And if we can reconfigure technologies, especially through things like open source, free software, open hardware which is for security reasons at least, it's verifiable, but it's also stuff that's not going to get into the sort of disposal cycle because it's got security flaws. It can be reprogrammed. It doesn't have these hidden enclaves, which are Intel and AMD now. It's absolute travesty. What they're up to is modifying microprocessors to kind of make them defective by design, to break them in ways that mean that at some point you won't be able to trust them anymore. So you just have to throw them away for security reasons. If we can, it's such a big landscape of things to fight against. But if you can, there is no reason why we can't have computing technology, which is very much like the kind of electric bicycle that you describe. It's just a win. It's a win-win technology.
How do we get the change, right? So I look at there's three agents or three parties at play. There's the brands or the companies, there's the government, and there's the society. And what I see, the path forward is, we see the success of the right to repair movement, where it's not got total success, but in, about 10 years, there's loads of legislation rolling through the European Union and the United States. And that was just a small group of people. But I think that, to me, is the only place real change is going to come from, is not from individuals and your individual carbon footprint and reducing it, although that's great. But it is by groups, us coming together around interests like the open source community, and that building, that the creation of these a kind of community level or peer level type pressure groups, that, because I think a lot of politicians want to make the change, but they're scared. They don't have some of them are bought, I'm sure, in everything. But I think there's a big fear in the political space of these huge brands and the power of the brands. And if there was enough societal pressure building, the society and the political system could, make these large brands, because I'm not saying the big brands are evil or anything like that, but I think they're just in a system that they will never be the initiator of this change, because they make too much money off and power is achieved too much. But that idea, to me, is, if somebody's listening to this and you really, collaborate, find a way of working with other people like you to create a pressure group, because I think it's the pressure groups that emanate from the societal level that have the greatest chance to drive the change that we need to see. Or what do you think about that? To some of we're seeing someone's listening and saying, what can I do? And I give these webinars and say it's not enough for you to say, yeah, that's good. You got to become an evangelist today. Or would you agree, disagree? What do you think?
Well, let's, because there's two kinds of strategies that we're talking about. One is on the individual level, and one is kind of in organizational level, coordination kind of thing. I think they're both important. I think individuals are still scared of technology. If we want to take back tech, we have to remember that there was in the 70s and 80s a program of digital literacy. And it suited governments at the time to teach people of all the amazing things that computers could do, so that we'd all become part of the digital economy and that our countries wouldn't be left behind, if you like. That was very successful, and it kick-started the games industry and digital film industry and just so much stuff. I mean, everything. We know what microelectronic revolution has done. It's changed everything. But that was an incomplete revolution. There's a necessary for a second stage, digital literacy 2.0, if you like, which is where people understand that there's a lot of bad things that computers can do, and how do we stop them from doing that? It's the kind of morning after the big party, right? That now we've been through the last 50 years, and we're looking at what are the effects on society, the threats to democracy, the threats to mental health, the potential for dystopian kind of tyranny through technology, and things like cashless society, which would be an absolute catastrophe. Yeah? These things are, until they're in the minds of people generally, there isn't that way to move to that next step of kind of collective thought and coordination, because we don't have common terminology and vocabulary and language and so on to understand the threats and the solutions. So on the one level, you do have as an individual to sort of step up and be that awkward, inconvenient person, the unreasonable man from which all change comes, to say, no, you're at a restaurant and it's contactless and they're going to scan this QR code, and just be that awkward person who says no. And here's why, and have your reasons for saying it. Or to be the person who's got the 10-year-old phone that looks really uncool. And there has to be an element of sort of self-sacrifice or ability to step up and make a statement on the individual level, because people follow things like that. You think, oh, wow, you're being so uncool, right? But then they look at you and you don't realize that they kind of want to be like that, right? It's like, wow, you've got you're prepared to stand up for these. Why? Tell us. And then there's an opportunity in the conversation to say, well, I think about the environment. I think about the education and mental health of the children. I think about these people in faraway lands that are dying, chopping up our e-waste. There's a whole new conversation to have about the ecology and socio-politics of technology. That's not around at the moment. People are just kind of like grazing cows in a field, just consuming. So be the icebreaker in that sense. But then when it comes to the collective mind, absolutely nothing is going to change until there is a new information landscape and new forces in the marketplace, like the open source movement, like the right to repair movement, and things like that, that can be seen as a much bigger visible voice and a movement for change. So we need both of those things for definite. Yeah.
Maybe we have reached peak attention, economy, and that that'll have very interesting implications for the tech industry.
Yeah, well, you go to Douglas Adams for the answer to that. You remember the electric monks, right? The electric monks was a labour-saving device that does your believing for you. And you can kind of see that happening with AI, right? So what AI is doing, the way that it's being pushed and marketed to people, is that it takes over areas of your cognitive function and your social function and things, your creative function. So you don't now you've got attention freed up to consume other things, and what you kind of end up with is this electronic device that's running. I mean, I imagined this story. I had this story in my head. I'll share it. And I thought I should write this as a piece of science fiction, of a guy who loses his phone. And for days and days he's anxious and worrying about it, and then eventually he realizes that they're never going to find this phone. But then he starts getting like strange messages and things. And what's happened is that the phone has just gone off and it's living its life for him to start with. It's booking hotels and it's met another phone. It's run off together because these devices have become de facto citadels for so much of our lives that they can, once you add AI to that, now they can function autonomously. So eventually, he's homeless and it's like the phone's kind of taken over what was his life, and that's where the AI is kind of going. So once we've reached capacity, that's not the limit. That's not the limit for if you follow that kind of appetitive. I try not to use the word capitalism because that's not what I'm after. It's expansive momentum for technology. Is that you don't need people anymore. Well, what happens then is that the technology starts to push the people out to the margins, in accordance with all classic science fiction. That's and you can see the realistic trajectory of how that would unfold in our technological society today. We've become so much more disconnected with the things that are elements of life. For example, you could have the thing kind of go and watch a film for you at the cinema, and then kind of using that AI to give you a summary and tell you whether you really would have enjoyed going to see it or not. That kind of crazy talk.
Could we design something that could last almost a lifetime, that it's a kind of framework, like you talked about interoperability, that, you just keep replacing the screen, or gradually it does get replaced, but it's modularly replaced.
Yeah, well, yes is the answer. Yes, but for very small values of yes, because I kind of already have that. I've got a heterogeneous technological life thing around me in my room now. I've got an old CRT monitor still. I've got a 1970s telephone that I love. I've got it, I've rebuilt it so that it will work with modern VoIP and stuff. So you can keep using technology and bring it back to life. But I think the answer is really no, just because of the rate of advance in technologies. Within 10 years, you get something which is so different and so much more advanced that it completely obsoletes the thing that came before it. And it's very hard to physically make it connect and interoperate over such time scales. But however, if you build that in as a design criteria from the beginning, using through standards bodies, through interoperability frameworks, standardized connectors, and you have a long-term support and a lifetime for them, which is measured in decades. I mean, look, some connectors are still around, like the old RS-232 and Canon connectors, and they're still used, right? They haven't changed since the 70s. But when you've got people at Apple making a new sort of Lightning connector or something, and then the next year they change it to something else, that's not okay. That's deliberately breaking forward interoperability. So if you build that in from the beginning, yes, you could do that within limits.
If you're interested in these sorts of ideas, please check out my book, Worldwide Waste, at gerrymcgovern.com. To hear other interesting podcasts, please visit thisishcd.com.